conversation discussing critical issues. So Richard, please tell us a little bit about those highlights, and then we'll get the conversation going. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Neil. Let me start by taking the point of personal privilege. In 2013, NABJ presented me with its Ida B. Wells Award, and in accepting that honor, I said that my dream was for journalism to become an institution. Here we are in 2022, and Journal-isms is holding its first event at an NABJ convention, with NAHJ part of the mix, and it's organized by the Journal-isms Board of Directors, as we're now a 501c3. Thank you, NABJ. Thank you, NAHJ. Thank you, supporters. Thank you, God, and thanks to my Journal-isms Inc. colleagues. Now, in the last 2 years, 3 major events have shaped the news and our industry. COVID, which disproportionately affected Black and brown people, the January 6th insurrection with its racist overtones, and the George Floyd murder. On May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, a Black man, on a report that he had used a fake $20 bill. Floyd died after Officer Derek Chauvin pinned him to the ground with his knee, an episode captured on video that earned a special citation from the Pulitzer Prize Board for the teenager holding the camera, Darnella Frazier. The murder of Floyd followed by 2 months the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old African-American woman in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment. At least 7 police officers forced entry into the apartment as they investigated drug dealing operations. Today, this very day, the Justice Department announced that it's filed charges against 4 former and current Louisville police officers in connection with Breonna Taylor's death, and one report says they have been arrested. There was footage of both the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor incidents, and CNN viewers additionally saw CNN reporter Omar Jimenez arrested live on the air in Minneapolis as he covered a protest. Newspapers had already begun confessing past racism, but now there were more. The Kansas City Star, the LA Times, Baltimore Sun, Seattle Times, Philadelphia Inquirer. The University of Maryland began its Printing Hate project. Academicians published a book of research called Journalism and Jim Crow. That leaves just about 1,000 newspapers that have yet to undertake a reckoning, not to mention the broadcast outlets. As those who paid attention have reminded themselves and us, the United States is expected to become majority minority by 2044. In August 2020, the Gannett Company, owner of USA Today and more than 260 local news operations, announced plans to make its workforce as diverse as the country by 2025. It is implementing this plan. Others followed suit by appointing newsroom leaders with diversity in their titles, and with such promotions as Kevin Merida as editor of the Los Angeles Times, Patrice Hardy and Leona Allen at the Dallas Morning News, Maria Reeve at the Houston Chronicle, Monica Richardson at the Miami Herald, and Jesse Ogas, Executive Director of Social Responsibility and Community Affairs at KUSA in Denver. Now at that station, an uproar had ensued after it was learned that the station had ousted 3 Latinas in 1 year. Data journalism was already on the rise when the Floyd killing happened, and news organizations put in service issues that people of color cared about. I'm sorry, they put the data journalism in service of these issues. The Washington Post in 2015 compiled a database of every fatal shooting in the United States by a police officer in the line of duty. This year, the New York Times staff won the Pulitzer for national reporting for, quoting, an ambitious project that quantified a disturbing pattern of fatal traffic stops by police, illustrating how hundreds of deaths could have been avoided and how officers typically avoided punishment. At a journalism's roundtable we had with Pulitzer winners and finalists, we learned that this was an idea from Dean Baquet, the Times' first Black top editor, who had just stepped down this past June. There were other ramifications. The Times, the Associated Press, and others acceded to demands to capitalize the B in Black, and to entertain discussions about what constitutes objectivity and whether that should be a goal. Now, this objectivity discussion isn't just theoretical. At the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Black reporter Alexis Johnson was banned from covering George Floyd protests because of a tweet. She now works at Vice News. Having to cover Black pain took a toll. Freelancer Patrice Peck wrote in May 2020 in the New York Times, "Investment in Black journalists is critical, not only through equitable compensation for our contributions, but also in addressing burnout, layoffs, and mental wellness, particularly among those of us who keep on keeping on." On the promising side, the Organization of Newspaper Publishers, which is called the News Media Alliance, lifted up a partnership between the Dallas Morning News and Texas Metro News, one of Dallas's Black newspapers, as a model to be replicated. But on the negative, the News Leaders Association said it had reached out to thousands of news organizations about its annual newsroom diversity survey and planned to have 2,500 print and online organizations participate. In the end, just 303 news organizations responded. And at a journalism's roundtable we had with cartoonists of color, Ray Billingsley of Curtis said, "I can't name any Black people that work in high positions in any syndicate, not one." Hector Cantu, the co-creator of Baldo, about a Latino family, told of one newspaper that said to him, "We already run a Hispanic strip." With that table setting, let's move on to our panelists. Where do we go from here? How can we keep the momentum going? How can we forestall a backlash? I just consulted this week Hank Clibanoff, who some might know, co-authored the book The Race Beat, about the media during the Civil Rights Movement. He gave me one example of what can happen if we don't hold fast. He said, I'm quoting here, "We show how the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, Grover Cleveland Hall Jr., started out as a card-carrying member of the ACLU, the son of a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor who battled the Klan, a progressive who wrote in admiring terms about the bus boycotters and about the absurd behavior of the Klan and Klan-like thugs. But we show how, when the White Citizens Council came to Montgomery during the bus boycott of 1955-56, Hall went out of curiosity to see Senator James Eastland and was astonished to see 15,000 people there, including his friends, neighbors, his advertisers, and subscribers. That night, he abandoned his independence and switched sides. There are similar examples going both ways in the book, he said. God forbid something like that should happen again. But let's face it, our country is polarized and there is a backlash. After 2 years of covering turmoil and great losses, today we are here to explore whether the media are ready, willing, and able to get to where we want to be. Let me ask Michael Bolden, the American Press Institute. Michael, you've been announcing programs to make it easier for news organizations to move closer to their communities and to implement DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is in your arsenal to help forestall backsliding?
Thanks, Richard. One of the things that I think about a lot, especially now that I'm in a position of power and some influence, is what can I do to actually bring pressure to people to make sure that they follow through. And one of the things that we're now doing at the American Press Institute is we're asking questions about what is your commitment to diversity and inclusion and how are you following through on it. If people are not answering that question in an acceptable way, we're not going to work with them. We're going to close the door to some of our programs. We've reached a point in this country now where I think we have to start taking some drastic steps to actually encourage people to participate, to be transparent, and to have the conversations. You know, I think back, I grew up, Richard gave the example from Montgomery. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. That's deep south. The last person who was officially lynched in this country was lynched in 1981, Michael Donald, in Mobile, Alabama. That's recent history to me. And so I know about the possibility of backlash. I know about the possibility of people paying lip service to things and not actually following through. And it's one of the reasons why during this entire period of the pandemic, I've taken every opportunity I can to move up in this industry so that I can sit here in this chair now and have some influence and be able to force people to reckon with what's happening in this country and to have honest conversations.
That's a great way to start. I mean, that's a good foundation. Hello, everybody. I'm Anna Cabrera with CNN. I anchor the 1 p.m. show Monday through Friday at CNN, and it's such an honor to be joined by Richard and these amazing panelists to have this discussion. I know you have questions too, so we're going to try to work through some of those as well. We have an incredible lineup here with Leona Allen Ford, the deputy publisher at Dallas Morning News, Wes Lowery, journalist and author. We have Gilbert Bailon, who is the executive editor of KERA, and we've already met Michael Bolden, the executive director and CEO of the American Press Institute, as we discuss reckoning or rhetoric, holding news media accountable. Let me ask you, Leona, where are we in this reckoning? Has there actually been a reckoning?
Well, I'll say it's been a journey, okay, and we are still on the journey. I think I describe it as an awakening. George Floyd was an awakening for our organization and many organizations around the country. And that Gilbert and I were talking, Gilbert hired me at Morning News 28 years ago, and tells you how old we are. And
what do you mean awakening, though? What do you mean?
I mean that our company woke up to the fact that, hey, we let these diversity, equity, inclusion programs lay dormant for years. That we used to have, leadership development programs for folks. We had a minority recruiter. It became crystal clear after that incident that we needed to redouble our efforts. And that's how I was placed in my position to really start focusing programs around recruiting and hiring and development. I think we are still on the journey. I think that we all woke up to the fact that if we're not paying attention to these programs and efforts, that we're not being accurate in our coverage of our communities. Dallas in particular already is majority folks of color. If we do not somehow get our whole teams around the importance of this, we're not accurately covering our communities. So I would say it was an awakening that we are now being persistent to continue those programs. And we decided that we want to be on the side of right. We are still on that journey, I would say.
Gilbert, why is it so important if you don't have that diversity within your organization, and particularly with people in positions of power? How does that hinder or maybe even hurt your ability to serve the public?
Really, it goes down to the audience is what we're talking about. We're talking about a changing country that we are not reflecting. So there's been a large focus on the numbers, and that's important. Hiring is important. But to Leona's point, it's also the retention. There's a lot of lip service still. There's a lot of PowerPoint and, we'll check that box. I think an awakening is a good term because I have seen some progress. Richard ran through some very key, legitimate points. Now those we editors, need the resources and the commitment to get the job done. It's changing culture and it's changing coverage. And if layoffs continue, if you can't do the training to retain people, it will not get done. So I think there is an awakening. I was editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch up until about 5 months ago, and that's where Ferguson hit. And we recognized we had no idea that this suburban community had become 2/3 African American, and the police department was all white, the city council was all white, and there was great inequity right under our nose. That was an awakening. Now, did we fix everything? No. But I think it led to the ability for us to be able to take a hard look at ourselves and how we're covering these communities. So your point, Anna, is are we reflective of our communities that are changing? And Dallas, Texas is changing. So like where I am at, are we doing those kinds of coverage? It comes to coverage, I think it ultimately is because I don't think only people of color should be doing these issues. That's changing the culture that other people see these issues that pervade every issue, because they do. Every issue we cover, you mentioned COVID, you could take education, you could take health. All these things. If we get people who could drive that through and are given the resources, we could see greater change. But I'm emboldened that there's people at the top. That's not good enough. I mean, because that's only it gives a good veneer if they don't have the resources to support to hire and change culture.
Wesley, I've seen you shake your head a lot, and a couple things that Gilbert just talked about, I want to get your thoughts on. One being, he just said he doesn't think people of color necessarily should be the ones, or always the ones, covering stories that may have a racial component. How do you feel about that?
Well, I agree with that completely, in part because every story has a racial component. It's impossible to accurately cover our country, our nation, any community without understanding and recognizing race. And I think that the mistake we make in newsrooms and as a culture, because we are just reflective of the society we grow up in. We're journalism, we're not special, we're no different than any of the other institutions in America, right? I think there's a massive mistake when we think that some stories are normal stories and other stories are race stories. Some stories are normal stories and other stories are gender stories. Some stories are normal stories, other stories are sexuality stories, right? That these show up in everything we cover and everything we talk about, right? And when it falls to just a handful of us to ever be thoughtful, to read any books, to know any history, it lets the vast majority of our institutions, our colleagues, our industry off the hook, and frankly provides coverage that is inaccurate. It continues to ensure that we live in a country and a society where people don't know the things that they need to know, the basic history, facts, and context to understand the world we live in. As I was listening to all my friends up here, I was thinking a lot about that context, right? If we think about the United States of America, which is about 400 years old, we've been a multiracial democracy for about 60 years. That's generous, right? We're rounding up, 1968. So we'll pretend that that's a full 60 years right now. So before that, we are literally a white supremacist, racial hierarchy of a country, up until emancipation, at which point we are a literal apartheid state. Some people have rights, other people do not. In 1968, we ostensibly become a multiracial democracy where people who look like those of us are theoretically now full citizens, right? That's 60 years. So my grandmother has lived more years of her life, or about as many years of her life, not being a full citizen as she has now, having been a full citizen. When we look at the institution of media, like all of our institutions, it was created. Are you whistling at me, Richard? What is this? It's like there's a party happening behind us. The institution of media was founded just like all the rest of our institutions. It was a white supremacist institution. It was an institution founded by actual avowed racists. They're the people, go look at who created these newspapers, who we give out awards, their names named after. We would not like those people today. They would not like us. They would be very concerned about a journalism conference full of people who look like you and I. But when we think about our institution and our industry, right? If we say day one is 68, right? We'll start at zero. We'll round on a curve. Okay, from the moment that we have a multiracial democracy in America, American journalism has had three reckonings or awakenings. The first is, at that inception, the civil rights. Many of the people whose shoulders we stand on, certainly in NABJ, and I know our friends in NAHJ as well, were people who got hired because these newsrooms looked around, cities were on fire across the country, and they didn't have anyone who was brave enough to go to the black places in town. So they found the janitors and the receptionists, and they said, you're a journalist now. Many of the first black journalists to ever win Pulitzers were the receptionists at the LA Times covering the riots. And that creates the initial integration of our newsrooms, not because the white people who ran our newsrooms were so benevolent they wanted us there. It's because they literally could not cover the biggest story in the country because all their white guy reporters were scared of black people and couldn't go there. They get their asses kicked, right? Second, in the 90s, we have another so-called reckoning and awakening. Now again, this is following Rodney King, another moment of thrashing in our national conversation in society. We have the rise of so-called affirmative action. We have people who, in the post-civil rights world, in newsrooms have started to create some of these programs to bring people in. But we see a backlash to that. We see a lot of white journalists go on the record when you go into CJR and AJR's archives that white guy can't get a job in journalism anymore, they would say back in the early 90s. It's all these black people and brown people they're bringing in, X, Y, and Z. And we saw major thrashing in our newsrooms where people of color were now being hired in newsrooms, but they were still being treated like second-class citizens. It was clear that their leadership did not believe in them, they were not going to provide them with opportunities, that they just wanted black faces and brown faces, they didn't want black voices or brown perspectives. And then we saw the economy fall out. We saw the fundamental change of the way our industry works and operates, the depletion of classified advertisement, the creation of the internet, the destruction of the American newspaper as an institution and an industry. And of course, we were all the first people run out the door when that happened. So by the time we get to 2020, we have newsrooms that have ostensibly been talking and working on these issues for half a century. And yet, the Philadelphia Inquirer employs one black reporter on their city desk, right? And that's one example. We have many others, right? And so what we see is Groundhog Day. Over and over and over again, we are having a conversation today that smarter people had 30 years ago and smarter people still had 30 years before that.
And yet, look at where each of us have gotten. I mean, that's progress, right? I remember growing up and not really seeing myself represented in, English language news media. And now I'm an anchor at CNN. It's hopefully somebody can look at me and say that's possible for me too, because they see themselves in me. And so I know your stories, all of our stories are a little bit different, and yet there have been barriers along the way. I'm curious to hear, are the barriers today the same kind of barriers you all had to overcome? How do you see it?
It's interesting, I was having this conversation with a girlfriend at breakfast, that it was not unusual for me to be the only black person, the only black woman in a room, in a leadership, in an editor's meeting. That hasn't changed much, okay? Now there's two in the room when we're having leadership meetings. But what has happened, I think, is that we now, as Michael was talking about, have the influence to be the decision makers. So before, it's not just having a seat at the table, it's not just having a seat in the room, it is, I now get to make the decision. I get to have a role in bringing people on. And also looking at the numbers. Our data is we're doing pretty good at the reporter level, but the leadership level is still, we've got a long way to go in that area. So being able to pay attention to those things and decide that we're gonna have a leadership development program, we're gonna put the resources behind it, and we're gonna put people of color in it, that are people ready to go when there is a position that's ready for it to be filled, and then being able to make the decision that, hey, top talent number one is what we're looking for, but that doesn't have to be in conflict with having somebody of color in that leadership position. So now the struggle is really more being persistent and having continuing to have that challenge, but we've still got a long way to go.
Michael, get in there.
Yeah, because what we're talking about on several levels are the dynamics of power, right? So even when we look out across the landscape and we see people going into lots of great jobs with great titles, the question that I ask, what power do they actually have to execute the change that needs to happen? And even if they have the power, do they feel that they have the ability to exercise the power? Because one of the things we have to think about are the oppressive systems that have been in place in this country that have taught people who are Black and Hispanic and Asian and women that even if you're in a position, you might still have to ask somebody if it's okay, right? And so a lot of people who are assuming jobs that look great on paper are still suffering from that, and we have to overcome that problem. I want to make one other point on this issue. The other thing that happens when I take the next job, or Gilbert takes the next job, or you takes the next job, who's backfilling behind us? I was the first Black transportation editor at the Washington Post. I was the first Black editorial director at Knight Foundation. I was the first Black managing director at the JSK Fellowship at Stanford. I was the first Black person on the masthead at the San Francisco Chronicle. Who backfilled me when I made the decision to leave? Not in any case was it another Black people. Now, in a couple cases, they were at least people of color, but we have that problem that still persists today.
Why? Why wasn't it a person of color?
Well, so now we're talking about the need for systemic change, right? So who's making those decisions? Which again gets back to what I was saying about the dynamics of power. And frankly, it's great to have allies and people who say that they are allies, but there is a world of difference when you have us sitting in the chair making those decisions.
Good. Well,
Oh. I thought he was going to ask the next question. Gilbert, how do you change the dynamic? Because how do you break through this systemic problem?
Richard, if you don't mute yourself.
Richard, we can hear your conversation, just so you know.
Well, we talked before we came to this panel, the issue of accountability. So how does that come in? There needs to be transparency, there needs to be goals, there needs to be ways to measure progress. Because this is amorphous. Diversity is an amorphous term. Is it a hiring issue? Is it coverage issue? Is it community engagement? Is it, to your point, Leona, training and development? Is it high school programs to grow your own? It has to be tangible. Because as Wesley was talking about, this has been going on a long time. Some of us people with gray hair have been hearing this conversation for a long time. I do see some progress, but I also see some retrogression here that Richard mentioned the News Leaders Association. I was president of ASCD back in 2007, which has for years done the survey of newspapers. Having 303 newspapers do divulging their diverse numbers is horrific. It's backsliding. We used to get about 80%. We thought that wasn't good enough. So we have to be pushing our bosses to be more transparent about that and push them to do. So I think there has to be concrete accountability. It's not good enough to say, hey, Leona, you're a big shot at the Dallas Morning News. If you, to your point, if I don't have the ability to make change, and there are a lot of times, I know diversity and inclusion officers can vary from where they are. Do they have hiring ability? Do they have a budget? Or are they more just kind of an HR? That's fine, but we need to push them where they actually can recruit people in, engage, give them a budget for training, and then we can see some change. But that's not always the case. So accountability is really important that we hold as ourselves too. As people of color in management, we have to hold ourselves to account as well.
You mentioned earlier that because of this awakening, there's also been a change in coverage at those institutions that have woken up, have prioritized diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think as I look around, there are a lot of younger journalists in this room wondering, like, how do I use my voice most effectively and bring, my background, my experience that's unique and can be a real asset to newsrooms, and how can I maximize that? And I think a lot of us grapple with how much of my lived experience do I take and share as part of my coverage of a story. Wes, you've talked a lot about this, this myth of objectivity. And so can you speak to that?
Sure. I don't think we should set as our aspirational goal something that doesn't exist. Like, objectivity is not a real thing, and so that should not be our goal. Fairness is a real thing. I can write a fair story. That's an actual achievable thing. I cannot ever be objective on any story. It literally doesn't exist.
But how does that, I guess, integrate into, the foundations of journalism, of being objective?
The made-up
how you
white
tell
guy
stories.
ideas of what we do, right? Like the idea that as long as the white conventional wisdom thinks this is an okay thing to write, we can write it, or we can say it on air, right? We see this all the time, right? We see this on any number of issues where there's been massive shift over the years. The things that are objectively okay to say on air at CNN today are different than they were 10 years ago. Why? Because today it's okay for an anchor to cry when gay marriage goes down. In 2006, if you said maybe gay people should be able to get married, you get fired, right? Like what is objectively okay to talk about is not about facts. It's about conventional wisdom, status quo, and frankly, what's going to offend more Republicans or not, right? It's not about, and white people, it's not actually about what's objectively true or objectively not true. It's about what the society, the subjective readers, right? Because they're not objective, they have opinions and feelings, what they accept and what they don't. What I would say is, I think in this moment, in a moment where our media is far more democratized, we all have printing presses in our hands at all times, right? I don't get to only publish what the Schultzbergers say I get to publish, or what Don Graham says I get to publish. I can publish whatever I want right now. What that has done is it's brought a lot of voices to our conversations and to our tables who otherwise have not been there before. I think it's prompted and is part of a generational change. A lot of and I want to be clear, I think the differences in tactic and politics even between younger black and brown journalists and perhaps the generation older than us, or 2 generations beyond that, I don't actually think there's conflict between them. I think it's people, by the very nature of standing on the shoulders of folks who ran through walls, allows people to dream and believe and aspire to something even bigger and better. And so I know a lot of my mentors, people who I could not have done what I do without. For them, they didn't ever want to be typecast as the black reporter. They didn't want to be the one that because if they ever were, they would have gotten run out of the newsroom. Their whole job was to basically make themselves present as white to this newsroom so they didn't lose their job.
And they didn't want to be pigeonholed.
Correct, right? And today, I do think there's a different conversation, at least a different zeitgeist among many younger journalists, where like, no, I'm not going to pretend I'm not who I am so that you people keep paying me. I'd rather go do a different job than that. And I think that and so again, that's not a criticism of people who face different challenges and different obstacles and therefore had to make different tactical decisions. But I do think that has shifted and it's changed. One other thing or 2 other things that have popped in my mind as I've listened to my really smart friends talk. One is that if journalism as an institution wanted to solve this problem, it would already be solved, right? Diversity is still seen at the highest levels as a feel-good, nice, philanthropic, liberal, do-gooder thing that, well, when we have time, we can do that. If the people who make the decisions about our industry thought journalism was a journalistic imperative, it would already happen. They think having Republicans on payroll is a journalistic imperative. It's why they go hire them. It's why the president of CNN was on the Hill yesterday, kissing up to Republicans, because he believed it was a journalistic imperative. It's the reason every newspaper has a city hall reporter. There's all the cuts, but no, it's journalistically imperative that we have this person. So the question I would ask is, so look around your newsroom. You don't employ any black people, any brown people, any Spanish speakers. So it's not journalistically imperative. You believe you can do your job without those people. Because if you believed you couldn't, you wouldn't allow what is currently true to be true. Our cable news networks believe they can cover the country without having enough diversity among their anchors or their correspondents.
But I do think that's changing. I mean, if
A little
that
bit.
was
I mean,
the mentality. Well, I'm a product of the change, I think. There's been certainly a focus and an intentional focus that I know at CNN to bring diverse people into the organization and to nurture their growth. And I feel like I have benefited from that from people like Ramon Escobar, who was a mentor of mine at CNN, who recruited me to join CNN 9 years ago.
I was going to say it's about accuracy and authenticity. And you asked about the objectivity question. For us, it's, knowing what a street is called in a neighborhood. That helps us have authenticity with our readers. It's knowing what a part of town is called, okay? And for us, what you say is true, that it's a journalistic imperative, but it's also business imperative. If we wanna grow our business, if we wanna grow our audience, and the audience is becoming more diverse, it's a business imperative for us. So we're trying to hit it on two ends. Yes, we have to be journalistically accurate, but we're not gonna succeed as a business unless we grow more of the people who are growing our community. And so for us, it's helping our entire leadership, all the way through our organization, understand that it's a business imperative as well.
We have been in the business as journalists of questioning institutions. We question governments, we question companies, we question all of these things, yet we balk at questioning the institution of journalism itself. Someone was talking about the foundations of journalism. Okay, who established the foundations of journalism? Those are the types of questions we should be consistently asking ourselves of our profession to make our profession better. And I would say if we're not doing that, if everyone in this room isn't doing that, if everybody who leads a news organization isn't doing that, they're not doing their jobs.
I have a bunch more questions, and I know Richard does too. So Richard, I'm gonna give you a chance to get in there and ask some of your questions now.
No, I think you're doing such a great job. I'll just watch you and act.
Please don't hesitate to chime in.
Okay.
I do have a question about managing coverage and as it relates to diversity. And I'll come to you, Gilbert, since you've done it in a lot of different places. And I'll just throw out this example. You talk about the decision makers, right? And that being important to have diverse people in those positions of power. And so let's just talk about the decision about whether or not to use the word racist in your coverage. How have you approached that?
Well, I think there's a lot of different, I would say overall, people in the media are more likely to use terms like that, whether it's about race or whether it's calling facts that are being disputed now. I think we are holding that more to account. I think we have progressed where we can use the term if it's racism. I think there's some uncomfortableness with it, but I do, if
Has that been a point of discussion?
Yes.
About, is this something we should call racist or not?
Is that an opinion or not? Well, if it's fact-based, if somebody did something based on race, you're racist. So yes, I think we do that. But I do think there's different standards at different places. I see overall, just across the broad news media, there's more likelihood to be calling some of these things out. Now, is it good enough? No, but I think those discussions are being had. And I think that's the way it should be. If you look at how AP has changed some of the style, they've changed style to be much more inclusive in terminology. So I think there's awareness of that, but I do think there's still some trepidation. I think there's how do you call out and who do you call out, to your point? Who's being called out? Would we call our institutions themselves racist? That might be a little tricky sometimes, but that, if the facts are you're not producing the kind of coverage and you're not reflecting your community, you have a problem with race, however term you want to use that.
Well, and I guess I bring up that word just because I think language is one thing that's impacted in how we cover stories, right? Based on who the decision makers are at our news outlets. And there's also, how you treat people of color in your coverage in other ways. And I know, Gilbert, you've taken action in not showing mugshots. I think that was when you were at the St. Louis Dispatch, right? And so, Michael, how do you see it in terms of other ways media organizations can help break down stereotypes?
So, I'm a big believer in transparency and having the conversations. So one of the things that we're doing at the American Press Institute right now, we are doing an experiment in the Pittsburgh news and information ecosystem, where we're working with all the major newspapers, the student newspaper, there's a business paper involved, an entertainment paper, where we work with them to actually, first of all, examine their internal practices, where we do a big survey about what they're doing, who they're doing it to, what people think about in the newsroom. We also do an external component of that, where we go out and interview members of the community to talk about the perceptions that they have and what they think is going on. And then we're going to bring that all together to help all these news organizations form strategic plans for what they need to do to improve. So I say all of that to say, I'm trying to focus on some systemic change. Because if we can, with willing partners, identify some of the problematic areas and behaviors and make recommendations for them to follow, and follow up with them and hold them accountable to make sure that they are doing those things, we can actually have some real change. But one of the key things there is willing partners. I want to circle back to one thing real quick. When we're talking about the News Leader Survey and the fact that so many people didn't participate, well, let's also remember there were people who responded to Meredith Clark, and they were outright hostile and nasty to her. So we have to, remember that that is actually part of the ecosystem as well. So willing partners wanting to do the work, I think that's absolutely critical, and taking both a macro and a micro view of it to implement the change.
So Richard mentioned backlash to this movement and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what would you say? What do you tell someone who believes enough, it's gone too far, this focus on diversity, to the point that it's excluding people who may be just as qualified who are white? What do you tell that person? Leona?
Well, again, our mantra is we want the top talent in the country working at our newspaper, our news organization. That is not exclusive of having people of color. We still are white people, okay, if they're the best, but we also, for each position, because of some procedures we put in place, we want to look at, hey, where are you underrepresented in your department? Are you underrepresented in Asians? Are you underrepresented in women? Are you underrepresented in people to cover your, Latino and Black communities? If you are, and you have top talent, remember, the research shows that some people who are white will apply for a job if they are like 70% qualified for it. People of color think they need to be 100% qualified for it. Well, people are qualified for jobs that we have who don't think they are, and their leaders haven't thought that they are. So it's really just trying to change the mindset of, hey, we are an inclusive environment. We want to be representative of the communities we serve. We want to be, our community is majority people of color, so we want to be representative of that. So for us, we've doubled down. I mean, Richard mentioned the partnership with Texas Metro News. That's because it's a Black newspaper in our town. We would probably never have partnered with Texas Metro News 10, 20 years ago. But it was clear to us that we have a ways to go with trust in our community because we are not there. So we have reporters who are covering communities. We're also trying to really partner with people who know communities so we can get more authentic. So it's the right thing to do for us. And we've had some backlash. Why are you focusing on these particular neighborhoods? Well, because they are involved in education, they're involved in health, they're involved in almost every aspect of our communities. And people live here who care about those things. And so for us, it's an inclusiveness conversation. I'm happy to have that conversation with anybody who calls us. It's important for our community to thrive, to be able to focus on the issues that people care about.
Gilbert, do you have a thought about the backlash, or what some have maybe called white grievance?
Well, that's not an accident. I mean, this is, right-wing media has been creating that, and it's only gotten worse in the last, whenever Trump was elected. So, it is now, if we look at the Republican Party, has gone from conservative to fringy, and it's having an impact. There are readers too. Now, do we react to that? I mean, we do our jobs. We present facts. Wesley was involved when they went and did the police shootings. That kind of work where you can't dispute the facts is what we can do. And I think now more than ever, we in this room and others have to be charged by that we're going to do our jobs. We're not going to let that affect us. And there's a lot of people, when you're looking at the political, our governor is saying there's an invasion on the border. That led to the El Paso massacre. So we need to call that out, and we need to be able to say that what that effect has, whatever means. We can do it, whatever means. It can be through opinions, editorials, it can be through our own just reporting. But I don't think we should shy away from some of this, because right now there is a whole different ecosphere in fact, they were recently, they've come into Dallas, CPAC is coming, and they're going to hear the anti-version of what we're talking about. We have to be aware of that and do our jobs. That's the best thing we can do, is not to shy away from that. And it is difficult. You will get shouted down, you won't get interviews. But our idea is we need to present the facts. And I think with that and transparency and accountability is our job. And the others can figure out what they need. Some people will tune us out, but I still think there's a middle ground here that will listen to what we're talking about.
And communities are best served, we know, when there's a diverse newsroom serving them. And we do know through research, speaking of facts and studies and looking at all of that it serves the bottom line. So it's mutually beneficial for our communities and for the company, the business aspect. There was a report by McKinsey & Company that showed organizations in the top quartile with gender diverse executive teams were 21% more likely to experience above average profitability, and organizations with ethnic and culturally diverse leadership are 33% more likely to outperform their peers. So there's a business decision behind all of this. Before I turn it over to our friends here in the audience, I do want to ask one question, and I'll ask you this, Wes. How can somebody who is a journalist, who's not in a position of power at this point, advance the cause of diversity?
I think that, first and foremost, we're journalists. We do our jobs. We show up every day, we pitch stories, we tell stories, we move with integrity, we remain accountable to our audiences and in our communities, the communities from which we come. And each of us has the power to work under our name and under our byline and make sure the things that appear under our names have the integrity that treat people of color, people of non-traditional, whether it be gender or sexualities, to treat them with the totality of their humanity in the way that so much of our historical coverage has not. And each of us has that individual power, but we also have to seize that individual power. We all know this, there's no one in any newsroom who's looking out for you but yourself. The institutions look out for the institutions. They'll put whatever they have to put under your name, they'll cut whatever they want out of your piece. You have to, as individual journalists, we have to look out for ourselves, because at the end of the day, we are the only ones who control our reputation, our work, what appears under our name, and many well-intentioned people will set us up for failure. I also think that what we have in this moment, because there are more of us. There was a time when we couldn't have filled a room like this, and we know there are other rooms filled all over it. There were times where we couldn't turn out and see that at and see you hosting, right, or see Victor, or see Don at night, or whomever, right, and across different channels. We have a strength in community, in being with each other, and talking to each other, and supporting each other, and mentoring each other, in understanding that some of the fights we are fighting won't be achieved by us, but will be achieved by the person who's the intern right now coming up behind us. I think that sometimes those of us who've had to fight and work hard to be respected, to be treated the way other people are treated, it can leave a callus on us that makes us defensive or makes it hard for us. And I think it's important for us to remember that we're not in competition with each other. That in fact, we're all soldiers to a higher cause, and are co-laborers together towards trying to create an industry and a journalism, therefore society, that values all of us and values our humanity. And so for me, I would really love it if the generation, if I could just retire and be done with this, right? Because all these other journalists are doing all of it, it's handled, we solved all the problems, right? But the point is that I think the biggest thing we can do is our work, right? And that is what we do. I think it's what we do every day. It's what we all show up and do every single day.
And keep shining, and in facing challenges and overcoming those barriers or busting through those barriers, you're developing that resiliency that's making you that much stronger. Who has a question?
Hi, and one thing about individual power, I think it's important to note that there's also unions, and unionizing is a great way to challenge existing norms. But my question is more, what advice do you have? I know that there's a lot of people here who are going to be, things are changing, but they are going to be entering newsrooms where they might be the only person of color on their team, and they're entering and they're trying to make it to the position of power. But what advice do you have for people who are navigating this type of work environment that is changing, but there's still a lot of progress to be made?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll start. I would say pitch good stories, This is a business of storytelling. And I don't know any editors who will turn down a great story. It's got tension and you're telling people something they didn't know about, it's something surprising. Find those great stories to tell, and you become the person who knows how to find great stuff. You talk about the one thing people can do to advance the cause, it's that. But I was that person in the newsroom coming in, not knowing, being the only one. And you have to, it's a delicate balance. We talked about that this morning, where you gotta know how to push and how far to push and who you can push, but keep pushing. And finding some advocates and allies who understand what you're trying to get done, who understand what accuracy and covering our communities mean. But if it's important to you, you cannot shout, you're not gonna shout every day about everything, but if it's important to you, speaking up. And it comes at some risk, and it's not as big a risk as it used to be able to speak up. But you have to, if it's important to you, you think it's the right thing, you're in a position there for a reason. I've always felt that I was put there for a reason, and so I'm going to use the position. As Michael said, it's one thing to have the title, it's one thing to be the first, but you've got to use that position in the right way and keep pushing.
I just want to add, where are you pushing? It's something to think about, because one of the things I did in my career, I've been a copy editor, I've been a reporter, I've been a systems editor, I've been the operations guy, I've been the coverage guy, and I've been a masthead editor. And what I learned was that there were places I could go that I hadn't thought of, where I could wield authority to make change, and no one ever told me that was a position where that was actually possible. So also work on identifying those avenues in your newsrooms. There might be things you haven't thought about.
We only have time, I think, for one or two more questions. You had your hand up. Let's go back here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for the conversation. I came in at about 50% today because I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm the only black man or anchor of color at my station, and I'm torn because I should be on that desk right now. Your conversation's been very helpful to me because I got a lot out of it. The struggle is, having covered Breonna Taylor over the years, is seeing that there's been a difficulty with young reporters. Louisville, Kentucky is marking 48, 50, where we are landing right now. But you got a willingness of reporters to get on the street, black, white, whatever. It's not a racial thing there. The struggle is capacity, because at that age, the capacity is the protesters are going this way, and there's a brick that went through that wall. And so the context doesn't exist. The perspective doesn't exist. So where does that come from? Does it come from anchors in the building trying to coach in real time? Does it come from NABJ? Does it come from reporter responsibility? But the way you laid out, apartheid state, democracy state, white supremacy, the way you laid out the history of the country, you don't find a lot of people on the streets in Market 50 that have the ability to do that. How do we get them there to be better?
Really briefly, I think that it speaks to the importance of all the folks who are sitting to my right, who are in these leadership positions, who are editors. Right? We've all been the young reporter who goes out and kind of collects the thing, and the editor totally saves our ass because they actually know what the story's about. Right? We've all done that. We've all been in that. Like, I don't really know how any of it. I was on the plane this morning with Terry Samuel, who was the assistant managing editor of NPR. He was the congressional editor of the Washington Post when I got hired. I showed up in Washington. I had no idea how Congress worked. I still don't really know how Congress works, right? But my job was to show up on the Hill every single day, do all my little reporting, and I would call Terry and he would tell me what it all meant. And the number of times he saved my behind because of that, I couldn't even count, right? But each time I got a little bit better, I was a little bit smarter. Then he would go, talk to this person. When I was at the Boston Globe before that, I was covering city politics. And my two best sources were Adrian Walker, the pot-bellied, dreadlocked black Metro columnist, and Kevin Cullen, the Irish-American from local Metro columnist. Because every morning I would get my assignment, walk over to them, and they go, Wesley, what are you up to today? And I would tell them the story I was working on, and then they would riff for 25 minutes, and I'd write down every name they said and every historical thing, and I'd go into the archive, and I would write that I think one thing that is important, and we know, so many of our newsrooms have lost so much institutional knowledge as they've been cleared out and cleaned out, right? But we also know as with the internet and social, there's even more pressure to move more quickly, which means we're not stopping, we're not thinking, we're not asking questions, we're not getting a second person or a third phone call, right? In fact, so much of what we're publishing is in many ways less rigorous than it once would have been because we're moving so quickly. But I think that that's the thing we've got to focus on. We talk about trust in news and these ideas. I think one of the reasons trust in news has been harmed, one of them is because now we cover women and black and brown people, and a lot of the readers don't like that. But secondarily, I think it's because we move so quickly that there's not always rigorous. One of the best ways to be trusted is to actually be trustworthy, which means doing good work, doing rigorous work, knowing if I say this thing, it's going to be true. And sometimes that means slowing down, catching our breath, breathing, especially as younger reporters. And that can be hard. Sometimes it means telling your boss, like, oh, look, I don't know, I don't got it yet. I don't know, I'm not ready to write it, or just ignoring their phone calls. I do that sometimes. They don't love it, but just give me one thing to do, right? But the point is, again, we're the only people who can protect our own integrity. And so I think making sure we're prioritizing doing the best version of our work is the best way to, one, do the best work, and two, to build and cultivate the trust that we need.
And to build and cultivate the knowledge base. Yes. And that's something that we all continue to do throughout our career. And that's one of the beauties of the roles we have as journalists is you're always learning. There's never, a full tank when it comes to how much you can know about any kind of subject matter and the background or history of that subject matter. So as a journalist, how do you get better? Read. Try to make yourself the expert in every story you cover, and that doesn't mean just getting the bare minimum of interviews and video if you're, doing it for TV, or, just enough to fill however many words you're given in your newspaper. It's, really understanding that subject matter in a deep way. I feel like I've had to do crash courses on law, on politics, and the way the government works to cover the stories. My first day as an anchor at CNN, the North Korean missiles launched, and I had a 6-hour breaking news show talking about that, and I was no expert in foreign policy or North Korea or ballistic missiles, but you learn as you go, and you find the right people to call and the voices to bring on to help tell those stories, that those people who do have that area of expertise. Let's do one more question and then wrap up.
Hello, I'm Alexis Johnson from Vice News, who Richard mentioned earlier. I'm the reporter that had the tweet go viral from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Me and Wesley have done a couple panels about objectivity. I always love what you say about it. You say it a lot better than me. I've done a million interviews about it. I'm like, I'm no expert at this thing. This one thing happened to me. So I guess, Wesley, my question for you is if you could share advice for reporters that might find themselves in the situation that I found myself in. The woman over there mentioned unions. The one reason that my story was able to have the impact that it had was because I had union support to push back against my editors who made that decision, and that way my job was protected. A lot of times people don't have that luxury. So, when young reporters might come up in these situations where their objectivity may be questioned by their editors or older people who are not thinking the way that you're thinking about it, what would you tell them on how to push back and say, what I said was, you're calling me biased because I'm a black woman talking about a black issue, right? We're not talking about, you don't ever ask a white reporter, can you cover this white story? You know what I mean? I was able to say those things. How would you have other people push back who might not have union protection and have those conversations? And is it, like she said, worth risking your job over like you might have to?
I think that, so on the one hand, all these situations are very individual, right? There are times I walk into a room willing to risk my job, and times I walk into the room not really, like try to keep this one this day, right? And so we all pick our fights at our moments, obviously, right? But we also have to wake up and look ourselves in the mirror every morning. And so when I look backwards, I want to make sure that I'm proud of the ways I moved and the hills I was willing to die on. And look, I have very few hills that I have fought on that I regret, but I have several that I wish I would not have let someone speak to me that way, or I wish I would not have taken that on the chin. That's me. That's not everybody. I think first and foremost, you have to remember that you're not alone, and so therefore not to suffer in silence. And that does not necessarily mean you need to go do 77 tweets or whatever, right? But it means like pick up the phone and start calling people, talking to people, right? I think that's the beauty of this room and these organizations, is that what you are going through in your market, wherever you are not the only black or brown person in a newsroom who is the only one. You are the only one in your newsroom, but every other newsroom has one too. And those folks are going through similar things, and that community is really important. I think secondarily, you have to remember that, again, you are the only person looking out for yourself and thinking for yourself, right? I think sometimes, look, journalists, all of us, we're true believers. We wouldn't sign up for these terrible hours and not enough money. This is not a smart economic decision for any of us, right? We do this because we believe in the work that we're doing and the importance of it, right? But sometimes that can brainwash us into believing that our institutions love us. They don't love us. They love the money we bring in, or the eyeballs we bring in, or the awards we put on their wall, but they would easily replace us with whomever tomorrow. And we see it over and over and over and over and over again. With people who are beloved, people who are stars, people who are whatnot, until the bosses decide they don't like them anymore, and then they're not. And so because of that, I think it's important for us to remember that we have to move in a way that has our own integrity, that we can feel proud of, and I think we have to move in ways that lean on our support systems, that share information across our kind of collective community of journalists of color. And beyond that, I do think it's important and it's smart for us. And I always say, sometimes when young reporters call me, I'm like, don't get yourself fired trying to say what I said on the internet. Like, I'll say it, you don't need to say it. I can't pay your student loans. So you need to do what you need to do. But that said, I do think we are at an inflection point. We are at a point that is important. And it is important for us to, when we enter these spaces, bring the whole of ourselves into these spaces. As you noted, there's no white education reporter in the country who's been questioned by their boss about why they went to a segregation academy. There is no white business reporter who's had to disclose the fact that their grandparents owned a plantation. But we go to the church with an outspoken pastor, or our cousin gets arrested for something, or we have a loved one who perhaps is in the country without documentation, and suddenly we are not allowed to cover our work, or what we're doing is being questioned. And so I think it's important for us to tell the truth and tell the truth in public. And that's what I think so many of us are doing. I think it's so inspiring. I think the changes that have happened in this industry certainly build on top of, stand on the shoulders of people who've been fighting and working on the inside for a very long time. But these last few years, it was not about a bunch of meetings. It was about a bunch of people talking in public. And a lot of well-intentioned allies of ours said, "What are you doing? Please be quiet." And as long as I've been in journalism, people who love me and care about me and who want me to succeed have said, "What are you doing, kid? Why are you talking in public?" But there's no question that the industry would not be where it is today, having this conversation with this audience, with powerful people in our industry having to answer these questions, being held accountable this way, if we had all just sat down and shut up and done our jobs. And so as long as there's one of us in that room, they have to deal with one of us being in the room. And I think that's important, and I think we should all remember that.
All right, that is an amazing final thought. I wish you guys and I know Richard has a few final thoughts himself. Thank you all, by the way, for taking this time to be part of this important discussion and for, doing your part to add that diversity into the news media bloodstream. Richard?
Yes. Well, this sounds. Thank you. I want to thank everybody as well, and also to ask people to reach out to journalisms. The email address is contact@journal-isms.com, because there was a lot that was said today that we need to follow, and perhaps even convene one of our journalism roundtables around that topic. So we'd love to hear from you. Keep in touch. Read the column, find out when the roundtables are, but more important, you have the email address, so let us know what we should be writing about and discussing. And again, thanks for being here.